You know, his God, his
Hello,
godparent.
hello.
Okay,
So we're starting now.
okay.
Yes. So hello, good afternoon. Today our guest is the distinguished Professor of History, Professor Paul Lovejoy. Hello, Professor Paul. How are you doing?
I'm doing just fine. Thank you so much for
Uh,
wanting to talk with me.
all right. Of course, I want to talk to you. You're a very famous professor, especially if you are from the Caribbean. So our textbooks in the Caribbean usually talk about David Eltis and Patrick Manning and Paul Lovejoy. Those are quite famous people in Caribbean history. If you study
Well,
Africa.
I went to school with Patrick Manning, so he's okay.
Oh, you went to school with Patrick Manning. Which one?
Wisconsin. We went to Wisconsin together. He was
Okay.
just slightly ahead of me, but not much by a
Oh, so
year.
did you know Jeffrey Williamson?
No, that's not a name I know.
Yeah, he's an economist, but Jeffrey Williamson was affiliated to Wisconsin at some point. Patrick Manning knows him. All right.
No, no.
So
Pat Manning was okay. He's all right. He's gone off into world history, but that's okay.
I know. I know he's doing a lot of research. The last time we spoke, he said that he had this Asian research and they were talking about the slave trade. You're doing some quantitative research on the slave trade, and she's a computer scientist. So that's what we discussed. But today we're going to be talking about a really serious issue. Olada Equiano.
Okay.
Gus, his last name is Bassa. His first name is Gustavus Bassa. So that's the European name that was given to him. Who was Gustavus Vasa?
Gustavus Vasa was the first king of Sweden, who freed the Swedish people from Danish rule, and so he's held as a national hero for freeing his people from bondage. That's the way he's seen in history. And our Gustavus Vasa, the guy that people mistakenly call Olaudah Equiano, um, he was named. You know what they did was a lot of these slave masters they gave their slaves silly names or funny names or bad names or whatever because they had the power to give the name to somebody whether the person liked it or not. So his master called him Gustavus Vasa. Now, the reason his master called him Gustavus Vasa was because in England at the time, um, there was a play that was called Gustavus Vasa, the savior of his people. And the play was banned by Walpole when Walpole was effectively prime minister. And because it was considered subversive, because it was really talking about liberation of the people. And that meant, like they were doing this on stage in London. And Walpole says, well, this is sort of political because they're talking about the liberation of the British people. And because they were being ruled by a handful of aristocrats, right? Many of whom owned plantations in the Caribbean. And so anybody who referred to Gustavus Vasa at the time, it was like a joke. It was like a political joke. And so he was given a name as a political joke. All right. Well, Vasa came from a society, Igbo society, that believed in predestination. They believed that when you're born, you have a personal chi, a personal god, who in effect has already determined everything that's going to happen to you in your life.
Paul,
And
quick point. I love Nollywood movies and they're always talking about the chi.
yeah, and so he had his chi, he believed, anyway, that's my interpretation, that he believed that his chi had decided his name was going to be Gustavus Vasa. So why should he ever change his name, since that's what it was determined that that's what he was going to be called? And he said when he was given the name, he didn't know this, he didn't know anything. He couldn't even speak English. But when he learned later on that who the real Gustavus Vasa was, He interpreted it to mean, ah, King Gustavus Vasa freed his people from Danish bondage. My job is to free black people from slavery. So that's why he never changed his name. He never changed his name. Look, his wife was Mrs. Vasa. His two girls, they were little Vasas. On their tombstone, it says their name is Vasa. It doesn't say anything about Equiano. There's no reference to Equiano except on the cover of the autobiography. And on the cover of the biography, Olaudah Equiano, the interesting narrative of Olaudah Equiano or Gustavus Vasa, the African, what he's using that name for is to establish and to confirm that he was African, that he was born in Africa. That's all. He's not trying to use two names. He's not trying to hide behind a name. He's using Olaudah Equiano because it has a meaning for him from the society he came from. And the meaning was very simple. His first name, Olaudah, means loud voice. It is a name. It is a name that he was given. Equiano ain't a name. It's where he came from. He came from Equiano. There's a place. That's a place. It's in Nigeria. It's on the map. Osaka, which is where he said he was born, was in Equiano. So in effect, he's saying, my name is Olaudah, and I'm from Equiano.
Okay.
It would be like calling you Lipton, Jamaica. Because
Yes.
you're from Jamaica, your last name is Jamaica? No way. I mean, that's not. Igbo didn't use last names. They didn't have surnames. So anyway, and in his autobiography, he explains what Olaudah means. He never explains what Equiano means. Never. So anyway, the research is very straightforward. Equiano is a collection of four clans. Four clans, all right? The Ariam clan, the Aloko clan, the Oboro clan, and the Iberi clan. Okay, he was from the Ariam clan. The center of the Ariam clan was in the town of Osaka. Still is to this day. I know. I'm doing interviewing via Zoom with people that live in Osaka and who are from Equiano. So this is real. So where's the evidence? The evidence is in his name. His name and where he said he was born. He was born where he said he was born. He wasn't born in South Carolina. How could he be born in South Carolina? Get a name like that? Impossible. No one would know anything like that. And furthermore, all the people that say he's born in South Carolina, they have no proof. That the evidence that they provide that Vincent Coretta found was the baptismal record in St. Margaret's Church next to Westminster. Huh? And then it says, it says his name, says he was born in Carolina. I don't know why his godparents said that. He doesn't tell the priest, here's where when you're being baptized, who speaks up for you? The godparents. The godparents were the cousins of the slave owners. So why do we believe a slave owner now instead of the slave? What kind of bias is that? So that's where the falsehood comes in. The second document that supposedly shows something is on the Arctic expedition, but the name on the muster roll in the Arctic expedition is not Gustavus Vasa, it's Gustavus Weston. Now you've lived in England, you know how many variations in the pronunciations and everything. You know how strange the English language is in terms of the local dialectical difference. Well, you tell me, in all your time in England, how does Weston ever become Vasa?
It can't become Vasa.
It can't. They don't. They're two different people. There's no proof it's the same person. So that's just false to claim it's the same person. They don't know. There's no proof. And there's no proof as to why the godparents, said at the baptism, he's born in Carolina, because they knew he was from Virginia. How'd they know he's from Virginia? Because the godfather was Pascal's accountant. He was the guy who looked after Vasa's master's accounts. All right, he knew he was trading in tobacco, and you don't get tobacco in South Carolina, you get tobacco in Virginia. Right? So he was in Virginia. He was not in South Carolina. He was in South Carolina later in his life, a couple of times. So it's not that he never went to South Carolina, but he wasn't born there. There's no proof. Where is the proof? The second problem, anybody who says he's born in South Carolina has to explain, how does this boy, age 11 or 12, healthy young boy, valuable as a slave, how does he get from South Carolina to Virginia? There was absolutely no trade in slaves between South Carolina and Virginia. Zero. Got all the records. I have all the records. There's no trade. And besides, nobody in South Carolina is going to sell an expensive boy. They need the labor, for rice and stuff in South Carolina. They're not going to send a boy to Virginia. Doesn't make sense. Eltis, Coretta, and all the others who want to, create trouble, they want to say he's born in South Carolina, but they have no proof. Zero. All the proof is the other way around. That the guy's name was Olaudah Equiano. He's from Equiano. He was born in Lusaka, exactly where he said he was. The big problem was figuring out where in Nigeria was Lusaka. Okay? Well, the first person who actually figured that out is a guy by the name of Vincent Onyema, who's, I have no idea where he is, and no other thing but he published in Awari a book called Hail Lusaka, the birthplace of Olaudah Equiano. And he pointed out in that book that when he was doing field work for another project, because he was a political scientist, that all of the things that Vasa says in his autobiography about his hometown, he didn't get that from anybody else. That's what he knows from his own experience. He didn't get it from any European account, because there isn't any European account that talks about any of the things that he talked about. So it's all from Vasa himself. He said he was born in Lusaka. He said in Lusaka, this is what happens when women have their menstruation. They have to go live in a hut. This is how we treat snakes. This is what we do with, there's a special type of dirt that if you throw it into the fire, it gives off a pleasant smell. This is where they produce something which is actually a white chalk, which was used by people to color their bodies as like a cosmetic and used in ceremonies and things like this. Well, they mine this chalk, which Vasa gives the name for, and says they in the town that he came from, and they mine it to this day. It's dangerous work. It's women's work. Women dig these pits to get the chalk out of the ground that's white, that they can then use to color their bodies and sell to people who want to use it. It's not found everywhere, but it's found there. It's dangerous because you dig these pits, and of course the pits can collapse. And if you're down there and and the thing collapses while you're digging out the chalk, you can get hurt. You can get killed actually, because the side of it can just fall right on you. And that's, I've done interviewing. This is every detail he gives about his home village is true to this day. This is what people, they don't do certain things anymore that they did before, but they talk about them. You know, the guy that I'm most influenced by is a guy by the name, he's Elder Ben Amali, and he comes from Lusaka. Okay. He's an old man now. His dad was a judge during the British colonial regime. And he knew everything about the history. And he said, yeah, we were called Equiano because we're four clans. And what Equiano means is it means the relationship between four brothers. And those four brothers are the four clans, of which Vasa was from the Ariam clan, whose headquarters was Osaka. I
Yes.
mean, how that's
Explain
proof.
explain the idea of Olaudah again, the first name. What does that represent?
Olaudah, it means, it's two words. It means loud and voice. And then Vasa, in his autobiography, goes on to expand on the concept by saying, well, it also means, you know, somebody who's assertive, somebody who can speak well, you know, but the actual two words are loud and voice. So, and he said, my name is Loud Voice.
And was he given that name in Africa?
Well, probably because when he was a little child, he cried a lot and spoke a lot and, you know, was a loud voice.
Yes, I do remember reading that in your article. Olaudah felt that he was ordained by God to be an exceptional man, and later in life he became a serious Christian.
Yeah, well, he became a Huntingdonian Methodist, and they believe in predestination. And you know, and they believe that everything that's going to happen to you in your life has already been determined when you're born. And that's what he believed. So he believed, you know, he was loud voice who was going to free his people. He was assertive. And he was a good speaker, obviously, because he, you know, he went all over England and Ireland and Scotland and, you know, giving lectures about his book, about his experiences. And we don't have any transcripts or anything like that from any of his lectures, but he didn't just talk about what was in his autobiography. You know, he'd gone to all the hearings in London, the Parliament, that were, you know, inquiries into the slave trade. You know, he knew what was going on. He was political. He was an activist. You know, he was really smart. He writes English really well
Yes,
for,
yes, yes.
you know, so
He,
he's a
he was
smart.
literate. So when was he exposed to literacy? How did he learn how to read?
Well, he was, you know, this is a part of the book that I'm writing that might not be quite as popular as some other parts going to be. You know, he was lucky. Man, he was so bloody lucky. He arrived in Barbados, and he wasn't thrown into what was called the stampede. You know, where all the buyers rush and they grab these people like they're, you know, animals. And, you know, I want this guy, I want that guy. No, he was taken aside because he was already bought for somebody in Virginia. And that somebody in Virginia was a guy by the name of Campbell. In my work, I've shown, I now know his name was Robert Campbell. And I know exactly where he lived and where the plantation was. I've been there. There's nothing, you don't see anything except the landscape now. There's no house or no buildings or anything like that. But still, I've been there. You know, I went there. I don't know why nobody else ever done it, but but I've done it. And so he was taken from Barbados to Hampton, Virginia, to the James River, and then he ended up on Campbell's plantation, and that's where his master Pascal, the Navy officer, bought him. Okay, so the naval officer buys him in Virginia and takes him. Initially, he was taking him as a present for his cousins, the ones who were his godparents. But in the end, he didn't give them to his cousins, who were very close to his cousins, because he kept him as a servant during the 7 Years' War. And I'm saying he was lucky because on the way from Virginia to England, he became best friends with a teenage boy by the name of Richard Baker, who was on the same ship, and Richard Baker was being sent to sea by his mom and his dad to learn how to sail, learn how to be involved in shipping and everything. And for some reason, this little white boy became really good friends with this little African boy who couldn't speak any English, and he taught him English. He taught him. And they became really best friends for 2 years. And they were together all the time. They were inseparable. He taught him English. He taught him math. He taught him all this stuff. I don't know why they became so close friends, but it just goes against all the racist bullshit, because here's this boy who's white, and here's this boy who's a slave, and they become best friends. Now, isn't that sort of unusual? Very unusual. When they get to Falmouth, the first place in England, where he ends up because he's the slave of the captain of the ship. He ends up staying in a nice house, because he's staying with, he's only 11, 12 years old. He's staying with his master, who knows the wealthy people in Falmouth. And then he goes to Guernsey because the ship is actually from Guernsey, and we're the same thing. And what does Vasa talk about when he's in Falmouth? And he talks about in Falmouth the first time he ever saw snow, because it happened to be a snowstorm, which is unusual in Falmouth, but there was one. And so what he ends up with? He ends up playing with all the other the white children in both places. He ends up playing. He talks about the little girl. He's a little 11, 12-year-old kid playing with. That's not normal for a slave, eh? So he's lucky. Then in the 7 Years' War, he's lucky. First of all, he didn't get killed. Second, he was on all these ships that were the main ships of the British Navy, and he was a slave of a guy who becomes captain of one of the ships, Pascal. All right. Well, when in the British Navy at the time, on the biggest ships, there were schools, because there were always a bunch of boys that had been recruited, and they had to learn something, because the ships aren't always fighting. A lot of the times they're just sitting out in the middle of the ocean doing nothing. And when that happened, so he went to school on board a British naval ship. But that's pretty lucky. So he really learned how to read and write. He learned how to, and that's why he became such a good writer. And that's why he became such a good speaker, because he really learned the language, because he believed he was predestined to learn it. And so he did. He was a good student. He was lucky. He didn't get killed. Now, his master, Pascal, in the heat of the battle, you can imagine what happened, because, Pascal, they almost get killed. The ships get bombed and back and forth when they're fighting, with the French. And you can hear in the middle of the battle, Pascal saying to his slave boy, "Hey, if we ever get out of this, I'm going to free you." But then when the war was over, he didn't free him. He sold him. He was a real asshole, like most masters. But so then he got sent to the Caribbean. But by this time, he's been trained he knows the sea. He's been trained. He's literate. He's not your average guy. So he becomes really important to the guy who buys him in Montserrat by the name of King. He becomes important to him. This is a valuable guy because he can manage a business. He knows how to, and he does manage business, because what does he do? He because he's able to, on the ships on King's ships, he's able to, trade on the side. He talks about it. He says one time he goes to South Carolina, and the captain of the ship buys cattle to take back to the Caribbean because he's going to sell them, and make a lot of money because he's selling fresh meat, huh? Yeah, Bassa bought turkeys. Now all the cattle died and none of the turkeys died. So he made a lot of money out of that. And so he traded on the side when he was in the Caribbean. And he earned enough money to buy his own freedom. So he's lucky, And not only that, he earned enough money to buy his freedom twice, because the first time the money was stolen. So he had to do it all over again. That's why when he was born matters. Coretta thinks he was born in 1747. I think he was born in 1742. 5 years makes a difference. If he was born in 1747, it means he earned his own freedom twice by the time he was 19. Ugh. If he was born 5 years earlier, he would have been 24 when he did it. Well, even that is pretty young for somebody who's a slave, buying his own freedom. Not somebody else buying it, he did it. Now that's a pretty good business, man. That's a pretty smart cookie. That's a smart guy. He's really good. And so at the age of 24, he's a free man. He comes back to London, free. Yeah, that's pretty lucky. And then from there on, the luck just continues. He makes money. Coretta and some of the other people, they're so foolish in some ways. Let me tell you. They think he made enough money from selling his book. Listen, I've never made any money from selling a book. You don't end up you don't end up being wealthy because you sell a book. No. He ended up being wealthy, relatively speaking. Well, he wasn't wealthy like a plantation owner, but he ended up being prosperous because he was a good businessman.
Yes, I read the article. He had a business. You mentioned a guild.
Yeah,
Yes, some
the
guild business.
Placer's Hall. It's right on City Wall in London. It's right next to the museum where the museum of the City of London is.
And
Now
what did he
today,
do at that business? What type of business was conducted in that
he
facility?
rented the rooms. He rented rooms. It was an empty building, a huge building, and he rented rooms. That's how he made money.
And he was married to a white woman from Scotland.
Yeah, well, she was from Ely, really, actually, just near Cambridge, but they were of Scottish descent. Yeah, but yes, that's who he married. So somehow he met his wife after he published his novel, and she was obviously impressed by this very handsome, very articulate, very nice guy. So they got married, even though they, black and white, and that wasn't particularly a desirable combination in the 1790s in England. You can imagine this dude walking down Oxford Street with his white wife on his arm. He's pretty cool. He's pretty cool, and she was too. Unfortunately, she died young, and well, he did too, actually, because he died in 1797, and that's not that old. He died of diphtheria, and but one of his daughters died when she was very young, and the other one lived.
Got married to a pastor.
Yeah, and married a preacher, but they never had children, unfortunately.
Yes.
Because otherwise we'd have a we'd have a Gustavus Plasma descent.
Yes, like Samuel Barber.
Yeah.
Yeah, he has descendants. But I'm going to close this link and send another link because Zoom gives us limited time.
Okay.